Hey, deserving listeners, this is chapter 11.
Not 29.
Not 29, on our deep dive on the Duggars and ancillary topics. So let's get to it. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and professor. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast.
My name is Humberto Castañeda. If you've ever eaten triangular potatoes, you have me to thank.
So in the last chapter, in the patron section, if you didn't hear it, we went over 3 incidents that happened in 2015. We went over the timeline from 2015 until today. We talked about how the police reports were published in In Touch magazine, which alerted everyone about what Josh had done when he was younger to his younger siblings. We talked about how in 2015, so that was a big scandal. Then later that year, he was found to be on Ashley Madison website because it was hacked into, and he admitted he cheated and that he had a pornography addiction. And then it was alleged by Danica Dillon, who is an exotic dancer, that he had violently sexually assaulted her. And in that moment when I was reminded of that incident, that allegation, it really... even though it's in my notes, I'd forgotten about it because my notes are several pages long. It really pushed my perspective of the possible hypotheses that are likely into a zone that Josh is a monster, and there's a lot of indications of that even when he was a teenager. And I felt ashamed of myself because throughout this whole series and chapters and deep dives, I have been providing a perspective of like, well, we don't really know. Could be this. He could be a monster, but there's other possibilities. But there's something about the allegation of the sexual assault with Danica Dillon that we discussed in the last chapter in the Patron Zone that really just brought all the different details together that point in the direction that he is a monster that should be locked up until it is very sure, or at least monitored and supervised until it is very sure that he is safe to the public and his own children. So then I felt ashamed. I felt bad because in the previous chapters I was, providing all these caveats of like, oh, we don't know. There's allegations. It could be this way to go, and it still could be. We just don't know. But I worry that people listening would be like, I can't believe that Kirk is having this like gray zone perspective. There's a lot of reasons to believe this is not a gray zone kind of a thing. And so I just want to apologize if I hurt anybody or bothered anybody in that way. Any thoughts on that, Berto?
Yeah, like I said in the last one, I think it's complex because number one, there's a lot of stuff to this topic, a lot of facts and whatnot. It is true that both of us had, because we both had read and seen that fact, that accusation, and we hadn't made it prominent enough, that's likely, in our heads, and therefore, I could see how that happened. At the same time, you mentioned that a lot of what you were doing was to help give context about how when a family goes through something like this, it doesn't immediately mean the parents are monsters and everyone's a monster. And that was, I think, pretty important. It actually helped me understand a little bit more from that perspective that parents sometimes will not report, and that doesn't mean that they're all monsters, right? Right. Also, I do think that it is responsible podcasting to not state that everything we hear and read is always a fact, and we know incontrovertibly that to be the case, and that we are convinced of one. It's useful to give some caveats and to give some doubt. At the same time, I agree. I think that there are a lot of indications, and that's a big one, that accusation, that the guy's not safe for society.
And to be clear, it's not as if the allegations of sexually abusing his younger siblings is somehow lesser. That also is a major red flag. And by monster, I mean that someone has a lack of empathy or seriously impaired empathy such that they cannot be trusted to take actions that don't harm other people. Also, potentially a sadistic personality trait that is motivating him to actually wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to harm other people sexually, which is possible, quite possible given. So I'm not saying that this sexual assault on Danica Dillon is somehow like this huge, it's just the culmination. Somehow when I read that in my notes and as I'm talking about, it just all came together like, oh, wait, it's really hard to avoid the strong possibility that Josh is and might have always been what I'm, colloquially calling a monster.
There's a difference between, hey, there was a confused, traumatized 14-year-old who did some horrible things to their siblings, and the rest of their life, they always, it was a torment to them. They went through a lot of treatment. That's one thing. What happened is still horrible. It's a different thing to say, like, there's this person who did these things, then continued to do horrible things, including raping violently to the point of nearly killing someone. Like, that is, it's different.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think in my head, I was leaning towards that first one.
Yeah.
And that he was sublimating through pornography and child porn and infidelity. Okay, not great, but not necessarily on the level of harm and sadism that is sexual assault on someone who was willing to have sex with him, was consenting to have sex with him originally, and then he used that as a platform to enact his sadistic urges, apparently.
Yeah.
So it's pretty awful, and I understand why people were interested in the story, because if that's likely, then all the things surrounding this story, from the parents to the cult to society to TLC, it's like, how do things like this happen? Yeah. Similar to the Bill Cosby story or the Harvey Weinstein story, where you have multiple people over decades, similar to Josh Duggar, who knew or suspected, and many victims who had come forward of Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, and no one believes them, or there's statute of limitations, or the press doesn't pay attention, or the fans just want to ignore it. And it just points to our societal backwardness and corruption, that victims of some of the most horrific crimes are just ignored, oppressed, blamed, not given justice, made to feel... I mean, imagine how unsafe you would feel as a victim of a crime like this, and you see examples like this, or you're one of the victims of one of these individuals, and they just continue to get away with it.
Yeah.
And of course, you understand that Harvey Weinstein, Josh Duggar, and Bill Cosby are not the only ones that are capable of this.
Right.
The ones, there's plenty of other that are capable of this, and you don't know who those people are necessarily. Because certainly Bill Cosby, no one would have suspected that he would have done anything like that. At least I never would have.
No.
And you would never want to leave your house, because society just lets it happen. Yeah. Institutions let it happen. Coworkers let it happen. Friends let it happen. The press lets it happen. Fans let it happen. So it's it's not just these three individuals. It's so much more than that. That is really depressing and demoralizing and needs to fucking change. I mean, so the Me Too movement was an important step, but we have so much farther to go. And that's not, and we're talking about like mainstream progressive America. We're not even talking about what needs to happen within evangelical Christians or IBLP, these kinds of large scale Christian religious cults in our United States. And that's not even talking about what needs to happen around the world.
Right.
Because it's not like if someone lives in Saudi Arabia that we don't care about their feelings, So this is a world epidemic or a world crisis that is continually happening, and we're just apparently helpless. What am I trying to say? I feel helpless.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about IBLP. So IBLP stands for Institute of Basic Life Principles.
Sounds good.
It was basic life principles. The impression I got about the basicness of it is that the founders, Bill Gothard and other people, they really wanted to make it simple and digestible. And from the little bit that I've seen in the documentary and other places, I think they succeeded. The delivery and the materials and the slides and the lectures are so basic. They're so simple. They're not high-minded. They're very easy to digest. They're easy to remember. There's little phrases and
there's an aspect about them, not all of it, but there's an aspect about them that sound right. It sounds like they've got a ring of truth to them.
And I think you were saying that you would get creeped out by Bill Gothard.
Well, what I was saying about Bill, I was saying that I got creeped out by the wife, wife's
Michelle.
voice. But Bill Gothard reminded me of experiences I had in high school when I would go to some of the groups that were, led by one of these charismatic people. And it just had all that same, and of course that's what he is. It's just, I was like, I've seen these folk.
But to me, I can absolutely see why people were drawn to him. He has a very specific. It's sort of like a Mr. Rogers, and I hate to make that connection, but if you didn't know anything about him,
he seems like a nice person.
Yeah, a very
wholesome,
approachable. He doesn't come across as particularly arrogant in his lectures.
And, it makes sense that he'd be giving advice on how to raise people since he raised so many kids of his own, right?
Yeah. So, Institute of Basic Life Principles, founded in 1961. It rose to power in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of people were talking about the factors as to why it would have risen to power. And for those who don't know, IBLP was, the way I would describe it, and I don't even know if this is necessarily accurate, but it was essentially a right-wing Christian organization that was set up to assist churches. It wasn't its own church, really. And it would have a lot of teachings and materials. They, eventually they developed their own homeschool system. And so they made all their money from the lectures and the trainings and the outreach activities that they did. It's not like the Mormon church where it's just like, a church and that spreads through different, locations and this kind of thing. They're more of like this organizing body that organized and influenced a lot of churches in the Midwest, is in Arkansas and the sort of middle zone of the United States. And so rose to power in the 70s, 60s, and in the 70s, Americans were very scared and demoralized for a variety of legitimate reasons. Vietnam War, assassinations of various beloved politicians and activists, the decline of our economy, the oil crisis. There was a lot of domestic terrorism in the 70s. I mean, about Charlie Manson, but he was but one of thousands of small groups of people who were murdering and terrorizing and bombing and committing crimes and involved in crime waves and mass killings. There was a lot of that stuff. We don't typically talk about that for some reason, but it's a major part of our history in the United States. And in the 70s, it was a pretty bleak time. Crime was on the rise, and it was scary to a lot of people. And so there were a lot of people who were looking for some kind of answer, some kind of safety net. And there were a lot of people that stepped into this place, a lot of charismatic leaders, and maybe some helpful things. You could argue that Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers might have risen to power during this time as well, and they were a force for good. Bill Gothard was one of these individuals that rose to power because of this, and he would do this lecture series, the Basic Life Principles thing, and he would tell parents in these churches how to protect their kids from all these new bad things. I mean, that's not what he would say directly, but that's basically the message. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, that kind of stuff. And he would give these really simple advice, tips, and there were these programs that they would create that did things, like kids activities program, and girls they can learn how to be women one day, and homeschooling this, and outreach that, all these programs that they were creating, how to be a good partner in a marriage. And then they had their heyday in the 90s and 2000s. That's when things really were at their peak for them. And then throughout the 2010s, were experiencing a downfall due to controversies about sexual misconduct. And you could argue that the Duggar scandals didn't help, because they were highly associated with that. So just going over my notes here about the belief system, and I can't completely summarize everything. I just have some things that are highlighted that are, I think, important to point out that relate to the Duggar story and Josh Duggar and the oppression of women, that sort of thing. So it's hard to know the difference between IBLP and Bill Gothard's belief system, since Bill was the charismatic leader. I think we associate Bill Gothard, IBLP, oh, it's Bill Gothard. But, IBLP was a large organization with a lot of different charismatic leaders and lecturers. Bill Gothard just was the most famous and charismatic and well-known. So when I talk about the beliefs of Bill Gothard or IBLP, from my distance perspective, it's all kind of one ball of wax, but there might be some differences. But anyway, so the other thing that should be pointed out is that this, what I'm calling a cult, which, we might get into the specifics regarding evaluating cults later, but the beliefs of IBLP cult and Bill Gothard are not unique to IBLP and Bill Gothard. Many contemporary Christians absolutely believe in most, if not all, or even more, what we might call extreme ideas about gender and oppressed groups and how to raise children and what the secular world is up to. It's all, if you weren't in IBLP or didn't even know who Bill Gothard was, but you were raised in an evangelical church, a lot of this will sound very familiar to you, is the thing. A lot of it's pretty mainstream. But you could argue that some of it was a little bit more extreme. Okay, so first, I want to talk about gender and authority. So in my notes, I tried to have those different sections in my notes, gender and authority. But given the way that they are, you can't separate, you can't discuss those two things separately.
Really intertwined.
Yeah. So what was your take on gender and authority within this cult?
So on the one hand, there's the standard. I think it's really common for most Christian belief systems to have a paternalistic approach to it. Certainly, the Catholic Church is a great example where, the Pope's a man, the priests are all men, they can't even get married because, I don't know, women will distract them. But no, really, it was because of land reasons. But honestly, it was just like it's a man's show, and women are there. Like, oh, I guess Virgin Mary, that's cool and all. And that's true in a lot of those variants. Now, it's not all Christian groups and things like that, but especially not nowadays. But it's certainly a historical truth. And so that part's not that unusual. Where it goes a little further as well is that they start saying this pattern of like, who is in charge of whose lives. So it's not just that, we need to all be subservient to God, and here's the belief system and stuff like that. And maybe it's right for the man to be the worker and the wife to stay home. It's not that. It's that, actually, the line of succession goes like this. It's God, then like Bill Gothard, then the man of the house, then the woman. And it's a very strict system. They call it, being under the umbrella. You will not only not do well, you will be damned if you fall out of that system.
Right.
So,
and I was thinking about this, and I just finally became galvanized in my mind that, you have God, you have Bill Gothard, and officially Bill Gothard wasn't in the hierarchy, but the way that he was talked about and treated, and maybe the way he saw himself, was that of a prophet, a modern prophet. They weren't explicit about that, but some of the people in the documentary talking about how they thought of him as a walking prophet, as a walking person who's connected to God. So you got God, Bill Gothard, then you have the dad of the household, the husband, and then you have the wife. That seems to say that there's equidistance between each of those steps, but the woman, the wife, is far below
that.
Particularly because when it's one thing if you're the dad, you're the husband. Bill Gothard doesn't live with you.
No.
And God is, there in a certain way, but in the home, the day-to-day operations, someone needs to make decisions, right? And God and Bill Gothard aren't necessarily there telling you what to do.
So who's left? Who's the next one in
So
line?
you got dad and husband,
dad.
and the mom, since she's subservient to him. The dad doesn't have to deal with Bill Gothard and God, but the mom has to deal with dad all the time.
Right.
And
the only people sort of under the mom are the kids.
Right. And so everyone in the church sees it that way. Everyone in the household sees it that way. Extended family. Every time you look at the woman, you're thinking, well, but the man, the man is the boss over her in all ways. Whereas when you look at the man, you're not like, well, I better check in with Bill or God. Right. It's a very different dynamic, and would be, and is it's just extremely sexist and awful. It's one thing for a family to choose to say, hey, in this situation, I want you to take the lead. Like, you're a better driver than I am, or you're better with the cooking, or you're a little better with the parenting. So I think, you're better at evaluating. You do those kind of trade-offs in a relationship, or you're better with paying the bills on time. So, you take care of that checking account. If it's a choice, but when it's forced and implemented and brainwashed into the women since they're born, then it results in people that are being absolutely harmed throughout their life. I mean, just imagine what that would feel like.
Well, and it's very common nowadays. Like, you hear it from politicians, Congress ladies saying, hey, the wife needs to listen to the man. The man is in charge, It's a common notion.
Yeah.
And I think what they did that was more than normal, because, I certainly had heard those sides of the religious argument of like, the wife really needs to be at home taking care of the kids, the man's in charge. But they crystallized it into near law.
Right. Like, I remember hearing growing up in my Christian church that was, in my memory, and I've talked to my parents about this as well, it was very liberal and non-oppressive from our memories, and non-political. But I do remember there were conversations about how the man is the spiritual leader of the house. But what does that mean? And I remember that being discussed because from my memory as a 10-year-old listening to the sermon or the discussions, that it was, sure, I mean, it says that in the Bible, and that makes sense to us because we live in a secular society. But that doesn't mean that the husband can just do whatever he wants to and control his wife. It just means that it was sort of like a figurehead, or you have the title, but in reality, we understand that women aren't under men, and so therefore women have power,
Right.
But maybe they don't have the title as being the spiritual leader. It seemed like there's sort of a dancing around.
Still a hand waviness there.
Yeah. It's like, well, we're following the Bible's words, but we're adjusting it.
Whereas this is like,
whereas this one, it just follows it,
and there's an extra insidious aspect about it, which is, hey, as long as you're under the umbrella and the chain of command,
right,
you're fine. But there's this implication, which means unless some weird thing happened, assume that the chain of command is unbroken. Therefore, you got to do what you're told.
Right. So let's talk about the umbrella, which I find to be in line with that basic packaging, right? It's the metaphor and the visual is so easy to comprehend. Right. It's not complicated.
Protect you. Yeah. Umbrellas protect you.
And fear. So it's not just like umbrella structure. It's and the members who would be interviewed would talk about this, not only in a documentary but podcasts that I listened to, where they would talk about how, and a lot of evangelicals and a lot of religious cults are like this, where they talk about how if you step out of line, very, very bad things are going to happen to you.
Right.
And the people you love. And there's this constant message of danger and fear.
That's right.
And threat from the devil to the liberals to the trans people in the bathrooms to temptation to pornography.
Which is why you can't start questioning the authority, because that leads to the problems.
Right. So the solution is that you follow the authority structure. And if you do that, then you're fine.
Right.
And if you are part of the umbrella, like you're the dad in the family, you are ultimately responsible for protecting everyone, right, which requires you not to just protect them, but to keep them in line.
Yeah.
It connects all these elements that sound, if you hear it discussed from Bill Gothard, it doesn't sound nefarious, but it is nefarious because the end outcome is that you have all the women and girls completely without any agency at all. They have to do everything they're told, but it's told to them that it's only like that because you're in constant danger.
And that's in their best interest.
Yeah.
But it doesn't remind me of, do you remember in South Park, the episode with the underwear gnomes where they collect underwear and then they have a plan? What's your plan? Well, step 1, collect underpants. Okay. Step 3, profit. This is like step 1, we have this system that's going to keep you safe as long as you stay under it. Step 3, it kept you safe. And then if someone raises their hand, it's like, well, what if the person above me is like, step 1,
yeah,
chain of command. Step 3, everything's great.
For example, what if older brother is,
what?
I'm under him.
Chain of command.
I'm under him.
Yeah.
What if he is a monster and is routinely raping me?
By definition, those things don't happen in this system because you're protected.
Right. Or he stepped out from underneath the umbrella, or like it all comes back to authority. Like they would word it that way probably. Right.
What if someone at the top of the umbrella, like maybe let's say right below Jesus, what if they're doing something wrong? Oh no, wait, that can't happen.
Like Bill Gothard.
That can't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think I'm realizing the genius of it because, like with the Duggars, and it was probably framed this way, that when it was discovered that Josh had raped his younger siblings, maybe there would be a sort of a outside chance that they would blame the younger girls and say that, well, it's because you weren't doing your chores that day or something,
right?
Or you let him, or you dress a certain way, maybe. But they would probably look at Josh and say, well, because you allowed sexuality into your mind, that's you moving out from underneath the umbrella of your parents and of God, and that's what led to you being tempted to do these things. And so the genius of it is, in terms of cult control and sustainability, is that the answer isn't to treat you or to look at the system. It's like, you just have to go under authority. You have to do everything that you're told and not think for yourself.
Right.
Everything is answered with that solution.
Yeah.
Authority, because you're always in danger. And the overall effect, like a pyramid scheme, is Bill Gothard becomes massively powerful so that he can do his sexual assaults on girls. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, authority and fear is a major part of this cult, and others like this, by the way. Of course, as we've been talking about, men have 100% authority over women. So Ephesians 5 is, I think, what they will point to. And it says, "Wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. As the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything." End of quote. So, of course, sexism wasn't invented by Americans. It's been around for a long time. And it was alive and well back then when these human beings were writing about things. These were religious folks back in the day saying religious things that were influenced by their culture. And there you have it. Yep. But because it's in the Bible, it's the Word of God, and thus you're supposed to follow it to the T, which again,
it's just that presumption of like, it's assuming, well, nothing's going to go wrong, but knowing full well the same book that contains that is filled with things going wrong everywhere by the same men.
Right. And I want to point out that the Christians that I know in Seattle, when they read this passage, they're like, well, the Bible, you don't take it literally. It's a interpretation of God's word. And back then, for whatever reason, that made sense to them. But it doesn't make sense to us now. We are positive that the Lord God, Jesus Christ, does not want us to do that because there's no point in that. Why would women be below men? That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, another idea is not only are they an authority, but they're superior. They're not just told that they have authority because they're inherently superior. Men, boys, males. Fathers have absolute power. So then in the documentary, it goes into spanking. We haven't
Oh my gosh.
We haven't talked about this yet. So what do you know about IBLP and spanking?
Well, most of what I know is what I saw in that video that was shown in the it was shown in the documentary, right?
Yeah.
With the older dude calling for a volunteer. I want to show you how to spank properly. Any boys in the audience I could spank? I mean, how on the nose can you get? And then this little boy comes up and he's like, oh, like, not sure what the hell's going on. And he proceeds to spank him. And then, oh, okay, no, it's worse than that. He role plays. Okay, pretend I'm your father and you've done something wrong and I need to punish you. So I'm going to spank you because I love you. So I spank you. And then when he's done, he's like,
well, wait. So don't bury the lead. The way that he does it.
oh, yeah, I know.
So he sits down and he gets the boy who looks like, I don't know, 8, 10.
He's little.
And puts him over his lap. And then, without doing it hard, sort of pantomimes, but
he's grabbing that ass.
But he's making contact
sufficiently
with this boy's behind.
And I'm not saying anything, but I am saying.
And the audience is laughing.
Oh, it's so cute.
This is, yeah.
And then when he's done, it's like, well, what do you think? And like, the boy doesn't thank him properly or doesn't say, or he doesn't seem happy enough or something. He's like, oh, maybe I need to spank you again. I mean, it's so, like, if you were doing this in a parody movie, you'd almost feel like, wow, that's a little too much.
Absolutely. If you were making a parody movie about, right. And this, again, this is a large, if this was like 30 weirdos in Arkansas, then okay.
Like, I can picture Leslie Nielsen.
Yeah.
Doing this as a joke bit in Airplane or something.
Yeah. But this is millions of people in the Midwest and the Mid-South of the United States. And they all contend. And the guy giving the lecture is a famous fellow who is known to be like the guru of spanking and parenting. And so in the video, it's extremely disturbing and creepy. Like, it is the definite, like, if you want to put in the dictionary,
creepy.
What does creepy mean? Just show this video. On the other hand, it's hard to, so the implication that I think you were making, and I think in my mind that I was imagining, is that he's a sexual predator and is just looking for an excuse to fondle children on stage. And the way he goes about it is just so
because he's got to hug him afterwards, remember?
Yeah.
You got to give me a hug. I'm your dad, remember?
Right.
Oh, and you didn't put enough into that hug. You got to do it again. That's what he says.
Now,
I'd have to spank you again.
It's creepy, hands down. I can't imagine anyone not considering it to be a creepy depiction of, I don't even know what I'm watching, honestly. So, girls and wives, mothers are all forbidden from having financial independence explicitly. It's not like it's subtly designed that way. It's baked into their rules that might even get as specific as women don't have their own checking account, or that if they do have a job, it can never interfere with them constantly being pregnant and taking care of household chores, of the fact that there's so many because you have 15 kids. So, there's a lot of explicit rules. In other pockets of society, it just plays out subtly. In this cult, it's explicit, right? Also,
yeah, like imagine a girl growing up in that cult, and you ask the usual question, hey, what do you want to do when you grow up? Think of how limiting.
Yeah.
It was already limiting for most of history for a woman to be asked that question. But think in that context, like how much more limiting.
But make America great again, Berto.
Yeah.
Boys are to be workers. College is discouraged, and any kind of intellectual enterprise or job is very much discouraged. So in these cults, when they talk about, boys are discouraged from certain jobs or college or education, that really underplays the all-encompassing nature of the mind control that begins from an early age, and not just from the parents, but the whole hierarchical structure. The parents might be enacting parenting styles that they wouldn't have ever done naturally.
Right.
And so it's this sort of pyramid scheme, and I use that because usually the cults, the Koreshes, the other ones, it's like the max amount of people you could have is 50 people,
because it's not sustainable after a certain point.
Yeah, the charismatic leader can only talk to so many people,
and you need that because the beliefs are a little too on the fringe or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So with this though, given
it's franchisable.
Yeah. Given how organized they were and how there were ready victims in all these evangelical right-leaning churches to begin with, they could top down through a pyramid, not pyramid, but a pyramidal hierarchical structure,
right?
Spread the notions that led to this cult that involved millions of people and abused millions and millions of kids. It's really quite astonishing.
And by design, are going to produce a lot more of those kids. That's built in, right? Like we got to produce a lot of kids and indoctrinate all of them. That makes our system so much more powerful.
Right. You need to have, you need to be pregnant constantly, and you need the primary mission for all those kids is to be part of the quiver, the arrow that goes to Washington, D.C. or on the internet and convinces other people or changes policy to make it easier or, more appealing or something. Okay. So another belief, so that's gender and authority, which we could go into more detail, but let's move on. Another major category of belief system is just bigotry. They wouldn't call it that, but, because this focus on queer people and trans people and gay people, it just doesn't make any logical sense, unless you don't understand cults. Because the power structure makes sense to the sustainability of a cult, right? It's logical. Right. But bigotry, like you would think you wouldn't want that because you'd want to control everyone and queer people will be discouraged. So what are you doing? Well, and this is widespread. This sort of bigotry is not just, in this sort of cult. This is a cult-ish phenomenon that exists throughout our society, and it has to do with in-group, out-group. The Nazis were like this with the Jewish people, and other groups of people around the world. When you are wanting to establish power and control, there are a few elements that will work on the masses. One is you have to inject fear, and sometimes they're already terrified to begin with, which we've already established that they were. In 1930s Germany, there was a tremendous amount of fear about war and about economy and chaos in politics. So you have a terrified group of people, and then you stand up and say, I'm going to be strong and I have all the solutions and I have no doubt that I can fix everything. You just have, because the more anxious you get as a human being and as a group, the more we will believe a strong seeming, convincing, narcissistic leader. The less scared we are, the more we look at a narcissistic leader and say, you're narcissistic. Yeah. There's something wrong with you. But in a pinch, we'll take a narcissistic because it feels safer to us. So that's another element. But fear has to be, and then you have to emphasize the fear, maybe amplify it, right? Yeah. Then you have
target it. Target the fear.
You need a scapegoat.
Yeah.
You need someone to target, and it'll always slot into culture. Jewish people in Europe and around the world, but particularly, if we're just talking about Europe, had been scapegoated for centuries.
Yeah.
So that cultural tradition,
nice and easy,
real easy. And it could have been anyone else.
Yeah.
The cultural zeitgeist was that the Jewish people were much more galvanizing to the mainstream German person than other groups of people. In the United States right now, it's queer people.
It's the extreme left, right? The extreme left, which includes the queer people.
But particularly queer people, because the fear of and the misconceptions are all baked into our society that have been brainwashed into us for generations about sexual shame and immorality. I put it in quotes, and in misconceptions about what trans, gay, bisexual people are capable of. They're crazed, they're compulsive, they want to indoctrinate or convince or assault people.
Yeah, I just think it's because we can't undercount, the whole thing they're against right now is woke. And woke includes a lot of folks, including black folks and other minorities.
Well, you could argue now it's the woke scare tactics, but back then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it's queer, it's gay people and trans people. But probably back then mainly gay people, because trans rights hadn't been spearheaded as much by that point.
And probably sexual liberated was associated with that, and there was this sense of if you're not standard heterosexual, you're also a deviant sexual.
Right. And expanding it, not just from that, but just people having sex outside of marriage, which was, at least popularity wise in terms of outspoken, was a feature of the 70s moving forward, and of course HIV was slotted right into their belief system. So when you're trying to establish control and a system, you either unconsciously will, through trial and error, learn this is what's going to work, or you literally make a plan to enact those kinds of things because you've learned from previous cults and high control people, including the Third Reich. And so you have to have an outgroup. You have to have the people that are going to attack you. And since the culture provided it on a silver platter, queer people were those people, and continue to be in our society. So that's another element. So you got authority and power, you got bigotry, or outgroup, in-group, and you also have procreation, is that good, godly women should be constantly pregnant. They don't say that exactly, but
close to it.
Yeah, when you hold up Michelle Duggar as the paragon of femininity in your society, and there's another woman who maybe does a little bit more family planning and has only 7 kids by the time she's 45, and you put Michelle higher on the praise list, it's clear. And you associate praise with going to heaven and avoiding hell. And
let's not forget that the family that only had the 7 children, you got to wonder, does that mean they had sex a few times without giving birth? What's going on over here?
Right.
It's a little suspicious.
And there's fear within the cult that because you have injected so much fear into everyone, and you're all terrified of all these things that you've identified as threats that are constantly, going to get you, then any sign that someone is not right down the middle cult behavior and adherence is a risk that they're moving away, or they're infiltrating or something.
And that'll spread like a cancer.
Right. And so in these cults, that's another element of conformity. You have to conform because the power structure perceives or picks up or knows that their power is based on lies.
Yeah.
And they understand, or they intuit, that it won't take long if your members manage to be influenced by rational people on the outside, that you would lose all of your power and all of your money and all of your fame and all your fun. And so you, even if you're in the middle tier or the lower tier, even if you're just a dad, you would perceive another family of 7 kids. It's like, well, if they're going to move away, what if they influence my wife and then I lose control of, it's, and then what does that mean? What does that mean about me? Does that mean I'm going to hell because it's my job to be the umbrella? All that kind of stuff. Okay. So good, godly men should get their wife constantly pregnant. That's another part of it. Children are their focus of life, which sounds really good, right? There are a lot of the Bill Gothard speeches that we saw where it feels good. It's like, children are our future. Children are wonderful. And children are pure and beautiful, and it's so great being a parent. It all kind of feels basic and good. It's the stuff that comes along with it, right? Yeah,
and this is, I think, also a key feature in a lot of cults, right? That there is some surface level presentation that seems appealing to the casual listener, right? It's hard for a cult to take root when it's like, hey, hi, nice to meet you. So are you interested in coming to our meeting on Friday? We're going to be discussing about how purple potatoes are really demons from the other planets. And it's like, oh, you lost me at purple potatoes, right? Instead, if it's like, hey, are you interested in coming on Friday? We're talking about how to be better people and how to improve the world. Oh, I don't know. That sounds interesting.
When I was in my 30s, I had met someone, and it was a new friend of mine, and he didn't bring me to Scientology, but he did talk about it a lot, and he was really into it, and the things that he talked about really changed my point of view about Scientology. He talked about how it was a lot of self-help and a lot of science, grounded things, that not over the top Thetans, it was all this. He was just a low-level congregant of this church, right?
Yeah.
And at that low level, it's all very saint, sort of like with Nexium, right? With Raniere. There were things on the ground level that, especially in the beginning, that is very helpful and powerful and normal and seems palatable. The further you go up in the pyramid, you have literally branding women, as sex slaves. So with this, they start with children are great, and what's so wrong about that? But then,
don't you want to, we don't get that many years on this earth. Don't you want to enjoy your time with your family and your children? Shouldn't you be there for them so that you have quality time with your 25 children?
Right. Yeah. And I don't know, but tell me if you picked up on this subtle message that if you put everything together, that they're saying it's your job to outbreed the secular heathens, and that's your godly duty. Did you pick up on that?
Well, so again, it's not presented like that on the surface, but of course, that definitely, because on the surface, it's really about this is what we're put on earth for. It's to give birth and to enjoy this. And remember, you're not supposed to be having sex for fun. Let's be clear about this, right? It's for procreation.
No.
And then if you climb a little deeper, it's and by the way, we need more of us because we are right. Everyone else is wrong. We need more of us to take over and blah, blah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's not the first thing that they hit you with.
And they are taking over,
yeah, exactly.
They're, whatever you want to identify. So before we go on, let's take a break. But the rest of this episode is going to be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to listen to us continue talking about this, and you want to support what we're doing here, become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.